Morning, everyone. It's lovely to be with you. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here in the last 2 days. So may I start off by just getting a quick sense of who's in the room? Is there anyone here who is not currently or has never been a student, researcher, or practitioner of science communications? Okay, so I'm not totally lonely, but it's fairly lonely space to be. And is there anyone here, this might sound strange, but is there anyone here who's not familiar with the UN Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals? Okay, you're all familiar. Okay, one. All right. Maybe we talk afterwards. So I am not a science communications expert. And my experience with notions of engagement have been essentially in the context of promoting so-called transdisciplinary research approaches in order to amplify and accelerate the impact of research at the global level. So I worked for 25 years managing international science councils, first for social sciences, then natural sciences, then we merged them and created what is now called the International Science Council. And essentially, that body had a primary objective captured by the notion of the vision of science as a global good, global public good. And that objective was indeed to do whatever we needed to do to ensure that by unifying the global science community, that we could accelerate, enhance the impact, the relevance of science in society. And that included sub-goals. It included advancing the health of individual disciplines. So the Council is a membership-based organization. It included all the disciplines from the international unions and associations, from physics and astronomy to the social sciences. I'm just going to grab some water. So working across the scientific spectrum, all fields and geographies, 145 national member organizations, members of the council. So as I've said, and the other sub-goal was, of course, apart from advancing the health of those disciplines in all aspects, promoting them, it was also about safeguarding both the freedom and responsibility of science in the global context. So I've got this nuisance of wanting to sign up to the Wi-Fi. Okay, so worked across the basic, applied, and action spectrum as well. In fact, and I'll come to the Sustainable Development Goals, but we never really distinguished. There were some examples, but we just thought this is about all science. It's about collaborating and harnessing wherever we can to address impact issues. And I assume that my contribution here today is that ultimately your goal is also as communicators to advance the impact of what we do as a global scientific community. And so my aim today is simply to give you some pointers of, at the global level, what kind of impact were we chasing, what did that mean, what has that meant, where have we got to, and then pose, I hope, maybe some insights or challenges for the science communications domain of practice. So in 2015, all UN member states adopted unanimously the UN Agenda 2030. It's a post-2015 development agenda, and it's known primarily as, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. It's an indivisible agenda, and it's a universal agenda, and it was adopted at a moment of real optimism in the multilateral system as ushering in a new world order where we're all going to collaborate and solve the world's problems by 2030. And I think this has had a really profound impact on science globally and on the visibility and voice of science, which I think is really important for you as communicators. But it's also mobilized an incredible response from the global scientific community. And at the recent September 24 UN Summit for the Future, governments, member states reaffirmed their commitment. So the SDGs, the Agenda 2030, remains in place as a global framework that rallies that at least when you're working in global science policy, is your kind of go-to framework for chasing impact. Let me not talk about the impact it's had on science, but just say it has increased the mandate for science, the recognition that science has to be part of not only developing these kinds of global frameworks, but also achieving their implementation, but that it can't do that on its own. It's not the silver bullet, but it has a position and a place. And you will see all sorts of new structures since 2016 that have been put in place, particularly within the UN system, where we as scientists can speak and participate, advise, etc. The response from the global scientific community has been across the board. So in terms of research strategies, research performance, you see individual institutions from all over the world, universities, academies, talking about the SDGs and their strategies. It's a cornerstone. We are ranking our universities and institutions according to how we do on meeting the SDGs. It's a new impact ranking. When it comes to research approaches, in other words, how do we amplify our impact as research communities, we've looked at, probably the most prominent approach has been this huge emphasis on transdisciplinary research, where academics and non-academics engage as knowledge partners in solving particular global challenges. When it comes to bigger research policy frameworks, we've seen the emergence in the last 10 years of the open science paradigm, also about science for the future, future of science, right? Sharing, collaborating, and don't forget one of the SDGs, SDG 17, is all about partnerships. In terms of research support, we've seen the global funding community rallying around the SDGs because it's a universal agenda, or posed as a universal agenda, which gives us a common purpose. Funders have been able to collaborate with each other in jointly funding SDG-related research in ways that we've never seen in the past, where they're actually putting money together into common pools and you know, at a global level, initiating funding instruments for SDG sustainability science. We've seen the science diplomacy and science advisory community rallying around this. Different story. And I can talk from experience at the global level, the International Science Council, one of the things that has always come up in discussions about impact is, oh, but scientists can't communicate. So we've had workshops, trainings, discussions about the importance of really understanding how we communicate our science. And all of this has led to, across the globe, nationally, regionally, globally, you've seen new networks, new initiatives, new communities of practice emerging in all these fields. Transdisciplinary alliance, community of practice around communicating basic science, etc., etc. So the question we have to ask ourselves, we've done a lot. How have we progressed? And we all know that we're not making progress on meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. We're in serious crisis. The time of optimism is gone. The latest Global Sustainable Development Report, which is prepared annually by a group of international scientists appointed by the Secretary General, their last report is called Times of Crisis, Times of Change. And, you know, there's a lot to be said, but essentially this notion of a global framework, global goal framework, it has led to a lot of talk, a lot of new structures, a lot of new, but little action on behalf of countries. And so the Secretary General has called for so-called urgent course corrections, where we really need to rethink what we can do to meet the 2030 objectives in time. And of course, we're not just talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, we're talking about their interaction with a plethora of other global frameworks, from the Paris Climate Agreement to the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction to the Digital Cooperation Roadmap of the Secretary General, and we have this multiplicity of post-2015 development global goals, but they're kind of all embraced by the SDGs. So when we think about course corrections, we also have to think about the world in its current context. And we all know that, I'm sure you've all come across this new notion of a world in polycrisis, where in addition to the typical global challenges that we're all used to, climate, biodiversity, food, pollution, etc., we're now dealing with war, new wars, new nuclear threats, major geopolitical disruption, but at the same time, this AI-driven mis- and disinformation movement, growing threats to scientific understanding and interpretation that comes with that. Other systemic risks like the pandemic we've just been through, and the failures of multilateralism. Okay, so sort of cascading systemic risks. And that's the context in which we need to ask ourselves, what else can the scientific community do? And you need to ask yourself, what else can science communicators do? And so it poses really deep and challenging questions for the scientific community. How am I doing on time? Okay. Am I okay? All right, so I mean, I don't want to go into, and the call, of course, that comes with all of that, just to add pressure, is that now, if we're going to, the urgency, the time is clocking, the clock is ticking, and so the urgency issue becomes more and more predominant, and so we're told the course corrections have to be transformative if we don't want this cascading systemic threat to be a real existential threat. So in other words, we have to go now for deep, profound systems change. That's our task. Also as scientists. And that, I think, poses really deep questions. One of them, for me, is that I think the time has come where we need to rethink what we want from science in society and where our responsibility ends, We are so focused on solving problems and providing actionable knowledge, and we maybe forget that a huge impact of science is just to prepare a critical, creative community of citizens, of global citizens. Anyway, we can talk more about that. So what else can we do? You're seeing various emerging sort of trends within the scientific community. There's a big focus now on looking at synergies across these global frameworks and how we can act synergistically. There's a lot of emphasis on how do we become serious about transformations? Do we understand it? Where does the knowledge come from? Do we recognize transformations when we see them? How do we deal with the issue of change when you're working with policymakers? It's a huge issue. And there's even, which I find very interesting, there's now a big push from the scientific community to also say, given this polycrisis world, we need to reframe and stop thinking about these various goals and ticking boxes, which SDG have you been relevant for? We need to think about this as a matter of global security. That global security is not just about war and peace and military paradigms, but we need a body at the multilateral level, like the UN Security Council, that will take climate change, human rights, biodiversity, etc., economic crises seriously as a matter of global security. So we're also involved in reframing the global narrative. But more practically and more down to earth, one possible route that we've explored in various contexts, and for me most recently when I was director of a Pan-African research body at the University of Pretoria for the last 2 years, called Future Africa. What we said, they set it up as a transdisciplinary institute to function across scientific fields, across the continent, and have impact on Africa's major challenges and change the world. And we said, okay, this is not about transdisciplinarity. We need to start understanding what transformative research might mean. And that means putting together transformation teams that become purposeful in pushing knowledge for specific problems. And it has to harness the toolbox of everything we have available. So it has to include interdisciplinarity appropriately, depending on what the problem is. It has to include whether it's basic science, applied or actionable science. It has to draw on wherever the knowledge lies, the relevant knowledge lies. It has to be engaged. In other words, it has to work with other knowledge partners, be they indigenous communities, policymakers, industry, the media, civil society more broadly defined. They are valid knowledge partners in these transformation teams. It needs to take on a systems orientation. The work has to be systems oriented. It has to be digitally enabled. We do need to harness the tools of the digital revolution. I'm going to be one more minute. And it has to be what I call futures literate, which is about making sure that when you're compiling these transformation teams, that you all have a common vision of what your goal is. Where are you going? Why are you a member of this team? And at the forefront of this, and a critical part of this transformative or transformations team makeup, is science communications. I think science communicators often we tend to bring in at the end, and they have a role to play in this transformative research approach right from the beginning. We cannot go to policymakers and share our research proposals and say, would you come and join us? They're not interested. We need science communicators to communicate those goals, to ensure that we have a common vision, that we are futures literate, and that we keep understanding where we're going with meeting those goals, and then communicating the outcome of what we hope might be knowledge that is both actionable and transformative. Thanks very much.